Hey friends, welcome back. This is episode 83. And this week we're going to talk about epigenetics and your grandkids.
So, epigenetics, if you haven't heard of it, is this idea of how we influence our genetics, right?
Mhm.
So we know that all humans have genes, right? We have DNA. Half of those genes are from mom, half of those genes are from dad. In the world of genetics, so even though those genes are instructions for specific things, right? Like you're going to have blue eyes or brown eyes or black hair, right? Or what color your skin's going to be. Those genes that are associated with illness, right? With our risk of cancer, our risk for chronic disease, those genes, we have the opportunity to either influence them, to turn them on or turn them off. And that's the idea of epigenetics, is that the genes that I got from my parents are not what writes my history, right?
Yeah.
Those genes I have influence over. And this is this idea of epigenetics. So if you have a gene for chronic illness, right? Say people have a gene for cancer, right? Colon cancer or breast cancer. Just because you have that gene, it does increase your risk to a certain extent, but that doesn't mean that you're going to get cancer, right?
It just means that you possess the light switch
Yes.
for colon cancer. Some people don't possess the light switch for colon cancer, right?
Exactly.
And some people do possess it, but that doesn't mean the light switch is on all the time. It can be turned on or off.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, some people may also get colon cancer who don't have a genetic predisposition, and that's because of lifestyle and diet. But what also influences that light switch is our lifestyle and diet. So if you don't eat a lot of fiber, right? If you're eating a lot of acidic foods, a lot of processed foods, simple carbohydrates, if you're around a lot of environmental toxicities, right? If you live in an area that's kind of really polluted, or you're using a lot of toxic products in your house or on your skin, all of those things influence if that light switch is turned on or turned off.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tell folks, because I have a lot of folks who come in and who do genetic testing, right? They want to know, are my genes contributing to this, right? Or I don't know if they target you guys, but I see this even on my Facebook ads of genetic testing for all kinds of things. Genetic testing for your mental health, genetic testing for your digestion, right? Or your metabolism, or genetic testing for cancer risk, right? Like there's all sorts of genetic testing now since they've been able to map out the genome. And so I always tell folks, if you get that genetic testing done, right, that gives us sort of the map, if you will, but you still have control onto whether, which direction you go. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to talk about that today to help to explain that a little bit, but also we're going to take it a few steps further than just our personal genetic disposition, if you will, right? Or whatever our genes write for us in our health. Mm-hmm. So when we choose, right, our health or our lifestyle or our diet, not only are we influencing our genetics and whether we're turning that light switch on or off, but especially for women, we're born with the amount of eggs in our ovaries, right? We're born with that. And then as we age, right, as you ovulate, you usually lose one egg or is released, not lost, but you release an egg once a month, right? On average, some folk are not on average, but what's considered cyclical, right? Some folks may release eggs maybe only a couple times a year. There are some folks who kind of release them a little bit more often, and that needs to be addressed. But you're born with, right, all the eggs that you're going to have. That's what we're born with. We don't get more eggs as we get older. They develop more.
Yeah.
So you also have to think those eggs as they develop, right, in an embryo within mom, that embryo is going to develop all the eggs that she's going to have in her life, right? So technically, as women, we will influence our kids, but also our great grandkids. Right? So whatever life decisions, health decisions that you make for your mental health, for your physical health, now is going to influence, right, 2 generations, your kids and your grandkids. Mm-hmm. We can argue that for men, that's also an influence, right? Still that intergenerational influence, because men will contribute that genetic information, that X or their Y to their kids, right? Which doesn't necessarily influence their grandkids as much, like at least the physical biochemical piece, but there's still influence there. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. So if you think, okay, at any point, if I'm going to have kids, whatever choices I'm making, I'm not just influencing me, but I'm also influencing, my grandkids as well. Yeah. So that is a different component of sort of the epigenetics. But when we're looking at our genes and genetics, we wanted to introduce that it's not always kind of just black and white.
Right.
Yeah. That there's a lot of influence there.
And the whole reason, this is going to be a 2-part series that we're talking about this is because we have a belief that it's backed up, that our mind, the way we think, our perspective, our beliefs impact the physiology of our body.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. I like to tell my clients what the brain says, what the brain tells, what it's doing, the body will follow. Mm-hmm. If you say, I can't run a mile in your brain, the body will be like, okay, we can't run a mile. We're not going to run a mile. If your brain says, we have to run a mile, this dog's chasing me, the body will say, okay, we're running a mile.
Yeah.
Right. So the brain regulates all the system. Right. And so the system just obeys. Okay, this is what we're doing. We're depressed. Okay, you say we have sad thoughts. We're depressed. We're going to down-regulate our production of dopamine and serotonin. Right. And so that's what this 2-part series is like. How you think, how you believe, the thoughts that you have in your brain that are unmanaged impacts your genetics, and impacts your kids' genetics, and impacts your grandkids' genetics. And so this is where you can start seeing generational trauma from a physical standpoint. And then next episode, we'll go into from a emotional teaching passed down standpoint.
Right. Yeah. I think so. A lot of when we talk about intergenerational trauma, right? We see, so my introduction to that has been especially within like Native American communities or like indigenous communities, because they're beginning to address that, right? You're beginning to address that intergenerational trauma. And we've talked about before, right? Trauma can be a whole number of things to folks. It's a matter of how we interpret that, those events. But we had a lot of families being removed, right? Like children being removed from families, or families being uprooted and removed to different places, and seeing things, death, right? And dying and illness around us, right? That creates this traumatic event that sometimes people can't get out of. So if we think how our health, our mental health, those minds, those, the thoughts, the feelings, the belief system, and our physical health influences our generations in the future. So then you think of, okay, my grandparents, however, the health of my grandparents is what's influenced my health today. And being able to see that connection and recognize, right, that the events that they have gone through, right? So even things, maybe not necessarily within the indigenous communities, but even things like war, right? Like war and illness and things that we've seen in this country for the last 2 generations, or our great grandparents, has influenced our health, and our well-being.
Yeah. So that's where I think we talked about this one time, and I think it's super interesting. You were talking about, because we were talking with a client about serotonin, right? And then you and I had a discussion afterwards about anxiety and depression. Does it come first from these neurotransmitters being off and that creates it? Or did this person's perception of this event in their life then tell the body to go into a depressive anxiety state? And you were talking about serotonin, that genetically some people are born with, and I can't remember what you call them, like both, like 2 genes that said we're producing serotonin at the most optimal place. Do you remember that discussion?
Yes.
Talk to people about like genetically, like that, just right, like serotonin, like some people born with both, some people born with the healthy and unhealthy, some people born with the unhealthy, and it's still that discussion.
Okay, so I believe what you're referring to is, my example is, if you, from the genetics piece, right, our body produces serotonin in a neurotransmitter pathway, right? And so in order to produce that serotonin, we have to take the building blocks of tryptophan, and it has to go to 5-HTP and the serotonin. But you need the genes that create the enzymes to make that happen. And so for some folks, if you have, we have genes from mom and dad, right? So if you have 2 healthy genes, that enzyme, say it's functioning 100%, right? It's 100% of the time, it's making that pathway go through. It takes that tryptophan, 5-HTP to serotonin. If you have one, we're going to call it unhealthy gene, a mutation, they're called SNPs. They're called polymorphisms.
Okay.
Single SNPs, SNP, single nucleic polymorphisms. So it's a kind of like a mutation, right? So say you have a SNP or an unhealthy one gene, and then a healthy one, that enzyme may only function 70% of the time. Right. Instead of 100%, those gates are wide open. Maybe it's like 70%. And then if you have 2 SNPs that are homozygous, that are considered unhealthy, then that enzyme may only be functioning 30% of the time. Right. Very rarely, it does happen, but rarely will it not function at all. Right. Sometimes if it doesn't function at all, those are considered genetic mutations, or like inborn errors of metabolism. And you see those as a baby, right? People will see that difference as a baby. But most of the times, that it'll either be that functioning, say like 30%, 70%, or 100%. And that's where you can influence that, right? So you can maximize that 70%, or you can maximize that 30% with our lifestyle, our thought work, right? Our diet.
But what, like, I love the ending part that you haven't said yet. That's the kicker. Like, because people are going to assume, okay, I'm born with both of these SNPs. I'm only producing 30%. So of course I'm a depressed, anxious person. I'm genetically born that way. And you said something, you were like, even at 30%, those people are happy, healthy, highly functional individuals, right?
Yes. Yeah. Even you can maximize that 30%, right? Our body will adapt where that 30% will be enough. That your body's producing the maximum amount within that 30%. So you're getting those serotonin neurotransmitters, they're getting released, right? You're stimulating those receptors, and then people are happy functioning adults. Or
So would you be able to tell the difference between the 30, the 70, and the 100% people if you line those three people up?
Or genetic testing.
Yeah. Because the body just becomes efficient on what it has.
Exactly. Where you see it change is if you dig deeper, right? You do genetic testing, you ask about family history, right? Was mom, grandma, dad, sister or aunts and uncles, do they have a history of depression or mental illness or suicide or things like that? But just standing them up in a row and not digging any deeper, you can't tell the difference.
Could you tell, like, emotionally, success, like, would they all, like, potentially all three could be highly successful, very happy, very fulfilled, normal functioning people?
Yes. Yeah. So even at that 30%, right? So even if you get the genetic testing and you realize you have 2 SNPs, right? Like I said, you can still maximize that. So people have to be, usually people have 2 SNPs, they have to be a little bit more diligent in their choices, really trying to kind of detox and making sure that a lot of the influences that can slow down that enzyme are taken out of their environment, right? But it's not as if there's a frank deficiency that your body doesn't have serotonin, right? It's just that your serotonin is produced a little bit slower. Now, that's compounded by our thoughts, right? That's compounded by our thoughts and our belief system is that, so if you're at 30% and you have this belief system that, you're of depression or anxiousness, and that's your norm, you can significantly reduce that 30% to like 10%, right? We're kind of making up numbers here, but and influence that in a negative way. Yes. But no, you can have people who have double SNPs who still have successful businesses, right? Who are millionaires, who go about their life, and you wouldn't ever suspect, you wouldn't look at that person and say, oh, that's a depressed person.
Yeah. Which I thought was so interesting. And I mentioned it to that client, and they were like, right? Because we're so conditioned. Old genetic science told us that you're born with this gene, that's your destiny. You can do nothing about it. So you're born with these SNPs, double SNPs. You're always going to be depressed and anxious, and that's who you are.
There's a great book by Dr. Lynch, I believe it's called Dirty Genes. It's a little bit of there's a lot of technical stuff in there. He's a naturopathic doctor, but he gives a really great what's it called?
Example,
like an overview. I'm like over picture, an overview of how we can influence, right, those genes, and that even people who have, that's what we call a homozygous, if you've got 2 SNPs, that may be decreasing sort of our enzyme function, but doesn't necessarily have to create a level of unhealth or illness in our life. He gives some great perspective in that sense of what you can do to maximize and like manipulate, if you will, your health. Even if you do find yourself in that, functioning at a 30% or a homozygous, scenario.
I'm writing that book down so I can put it in the show notes.
Yes. Yeah. It's called Dirty Genes.
Okay.
Okay. But so I think it's important to understand that, right, and to kind of recognize that influence. So even just within ourselves, right, and within our health and our lifestyle, is that a lot of people want to do genetic testing to kind of get a better understanding at like what their root cause is, and that's great, right? But also understanding that you influence, right? So that even though, you may have that genetic predisposition, that's not necessarily, I would argue that it gives us more information and definitely more data, but that doesn't always mean that that's the root cause.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And like we're so conditioned as humans to, I get the appeal to want to do genetic testing, right?
Yeah.
Because I can find out it's not my fault.
Yeah.
Right. Like I get to wash my hands of the responsibility and say, well, it's just my genes. Right. And I don't think that people intentionally set out to do that. But I also know how the human brain works, and the human brain likes that.
Mm-hmm.
My fault, somebody else's. I don't take responsibility for this, because if I take responsibility for this, it's going to be painful. I have to face myself, and then I'm responsible. So then I have to go do some work, and I could potentially fail at that. That's just how the human brain works, right? So I get it. There's no judgment there. Right. But it's like, do you want to, like, if that's the route you want to go and live your life, awesome, but it kind of renders you powerless, right? Like you're giving your power away versus, great, I have these genes, but I am in control of my life, my destiny, my health. So what choices can I choose? What choices do I need to make to optimize my genetic makeup?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I think, right, as curious humans, people want an answer. They want an answer. And I think that's where it kind of, I wanted you to say that because it can be very easy when people get genetic testing of, it's not their fault. They're like, okay, I have an answer. Oh, well, my genes are out of my control. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, that's 50% from mom, 50% from dad. Mm-hmm. So they're out of my control. So if I have kids and I pass that on to my kid, oh, well, they don't have control over that. That's just genetics.
Just your fault. You pass it on to your kid.
Yeah. And that it doesn't give the whole story. Mm-hmm. It doesn't give the whole story, and it doesn't show how you can still influence that, right? And you can use that information to get a better understanding, and then you kind of like meet yourself halfway, like, oh, okay, well, if I want this to change, or if I don't want it to influence my grandkids as much as it's influenced me, I need to do the thought work around that.
Yes.
And that address the mindset component, so that I don't continue to pass that down, right? That this is the way it's always been, right? We've always had depression, mental illness in our family, right? And suicide, you have a 50% chance that's going to happen to you, right? I mean, that's a really heavy burden to pass on to your kids and your grandkids, I think. And a lot of times people do it without even thinking, right? Because they don't think they have control in those situations, but it's the opposite. Right.
And like, and to tie it into next episode, like with epigenetics, you're in charge of flipping the light switch on or off with your choices in your life and your environment and your mindset, the thoughts that you choose to think and the thoughts that you choose to believe that are being offered up in your brain all the time. Right. And so if we do choose to, let's have a mom like that's like her mom, because there is like generational, like societal conditioning and trauma. Like
Yeah.
just let's just stay with the women right now, that women have been, I don't like the words that are very disempowering for us. We have not been appreciated and educated as divine beings as probably we should have been, right? Historically, we've been taught otherwise, that we're less than, that we're weak, right? And just back even to our grandmothers, right? Our grandmothers didn't have a lot of options that you and I do as women do today, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
That grandma had that belief system that was programmed into her, that she programmed into our mothers,
Right.
right? And they didn't know that it was programming. They thought it was simply truth. This is reality, right? And then our mothers have programmed us, and if we don't change the rhetoric, we then program our daughters, right? And that impacts our health. So let's say my grandmother, because of how society has treated women, felt like she couldn't speak her truth, and she felt weak and powerless, so she felt like a victim. And so she was depressed a lot because she felt out of control. Then she had this daughter that she taught the same things to unconsciously. My mother then felt very powerless and out of control, and just women are taught to people please.
Yeah.
With these switches on, they had these switches on for like depression, anxiety, right?
Right.
And didn't know that she had other options. So then when she had me with that same programming and those same genetic switches that she gave to me, and then it's at my responsibility now. Do I unprogram all this?
Yeah.
You know, and switch these switches off.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And I want to maybe normalize it, because it might be a little bit overwhelming when you think, oh gosh, yeah, I'm trying to address and reprogram and rewrite, right, 3 generations of thought processes, right, or programming or kind of training, or that's kind of been handed down, right? And in my opinion, it's not to the fault of our family, right? Because that's the kind of this unconscious belief system and training that has been created, right? I mean, you think, yeah, women didn't have the right to vote until 1920. The women, our role as women has definitely changed, over the generations. And I think more and more people are starting to recognize the power that we have to make those changes, so that it doesn't have to continue to down the line, right, for our kids or grandkids or great grandkids. But understanding where that comes from and being able to recognize I can make a conscious decision, not just how to affect my health, but with turning those switches off. But for those future generations within my family.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, like, and we can wrap up here, but like, if you have a mom that because of her programming is constantly stressed, constantly anxious, physiologically her body is different, because those states of mind create a physiological change in our body, right? And then she's growing a baby in this physiologically different environment. This baby has access to different chemicals, different acidic alkaline states within the mom because of her mindset, versus another mom that has a different mindset that physiologically has a different, I think you call it terrain. It doesn't have so much cortisol. It doesn't have so much, such a depression of society or serotonin and dopamine, right? It has more of an alkaline environment that baby's growing in.
Exactly. So that changes, right, and that influences how that baby develops, and then how that those eggs within that baby, if it's a female, right, but even if it's a male, how the sperm develops. But if those babies are all born and you line them up, right, I mean, they all look like happy, healthy babies, you wouldn't be able to tell a difference. But again, it's a lot of it is, right, like sort of the genetics, but it's what they're predisposed to because of those levels of chemicals, that biochemistry terrain that has influenced them as a child, like, as a developing fetus. And so understanding that role, right, and being able to consciously change that. Right. Some moms may get a little bit overwhelmed because they're like, oh gosh, right, like it's already hard for me to take responsibility for myself. And now, right, taking responsibility for the mental health and the wellness of my baby can be a little bit overwhelming. So you just start small, right? You just start small. And then even after that baby is born, you still have, a lifetime of influence on them as far as how they develop. And so because our body is so adaptive, right, we see this all the time, but because our body and our brain is so adaptive, we can create new scenarios, we can create new belief systems and different influences to our family. To our family. So
and like for those moms that are feeling overwhelmed, like you always have to keep in perspective, which I think is very difficult for parents. Perhaps you were that mom that was stressed, depressed, right, and while you were carrying this baby, and now you're like, oh my God, like what did I do to my kid and my grandkids, right? You always have to remember epigenetics is not just for you. Epigenetics is for your kid and for your grandkid, and they have personal responsibility for their lives. You might have set, unconsciously birthed them in this state, but they still have influence on their own health. They're their own entity, right? And they can choose to turn those light switches on or off themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. Our body is so resilient that, I mean, you think of like, if for example, if I am the influence and the product of my great grandparents, my great grandma, my grandma, my mom, and me, and I can make those changes, your child can do that too. Yeah. So don't feel like, we're definitely influence our children, but it's not a all or nothing, right? Yeah. They have that personal responsibility. They can get, as they grow and get a better understanding of the world, right? And then when they get older and able to make decisions for themselves, they get to choose that too.
Yeah. This is never a fault game. It's never no one's fault. It's I did the best I could with the tools that I had. Exactly. And when I know better, I'll do better.
Yeah, exactly. We're always learning in this journey. Yeah.
Cool. All right. You guys will have part 2 next week.